the Tea Party movement has been a global movement. Obviously, its origins are in the United States. We draw our history from an iconic moment of the beginning of the American Revolutionary period. We did that consciously. But when I look at Brexit in the UK, when I look at the emergence of new political parties in Asia and Europe, and the magnitude of feedback and guidance that I've been often asked to provide to emerging conservative, by that I mean rule of law, limited government, low taxes, and autonomy, which is kind of, I think, one of the issues Alberta's confronting.
So hello everyone, Nadine Wellwood, and today we are one-on-one with Michael Johns. Michael is a conservative commentator and a policy analyst and a writer. He was a former speechwriter for the White House, I do believe President Bush, yes. And he is the co-founder and spokesperson for the National Tea Party movement. And welcome. It's been
it's a pleasure with Nadine. Thank you. We finally connect with you.
We have so much to talk about.
We sure do, yeah.
We do. But before we get too far, because I could go so far today with so many different topics, could you tell us a little bit more about yourself and the Tea Party movement itself?
So in my own case, at least on the public policy and political dimension, I mean, I've been involved in this since the Reagan era in college. I grew up in the Lehigh Valley area of Pennsylvania, watched a lot of big industry in that region close, including Bethlehem Steel. There was a sense then, growing up, that something wasn't quite right, and also an obvious recognition that policymakers and elected officials weren't addressing it. And it sat in the back of my mind as concerning, but it wasn't as if I'd had any definable agenda or even party affiliation or ideological orientation. And I try to spend as much time as I can with young, developing conservatives of promise, because it's clear to me we've not done a very good job with that. A lot of what I'll come around to talking with you is a revelation on my part, not being widely enough discussed, that we're spending way too much time blaming the other side for their victories and not enough time assuming responsibility for this, as you typically would in a private sector capacity. In the public sector, it's like, well, look, they won again. They've look, the Washington Post has political bias in their coverage. Like we knew these things 20 years ago, and it's astonishing to me that we're really still waking up every day with some apparent revelation that we didn't already know about it.
Yeah, can I just interrupt? Because so I want to touch on that a little bit, because as you know, in Canada right now, we kind of have this East versus West that's happening. And we have a significant number of people in Alberta that really are left believing that the only option for Alberta is really separation. That's how great a divide it is that we have to overcome here right now. But what you did, interestingly enough, as a citizens movement, is you were able to make change from the inside of the Republican Party. And so what do you attribute? Like, was it timing? Was it, people were just ready? Or was it something that you guys specifically said or did that really, brought people out to these rallies and got them engaged? Because in Canada, like the US, I find is amazing. You can talk politics. You guys are lively, you're active, you're engaged, far more than Canadians are.
Yeah, my sense of Canadians can be very vivid and active and confrontational on American politics. That seems to be the main interest. But I will tell you this, the Tea Party movement has been a global movement. Obviously, its origins are in the United States. We draw our history from an iconic moment of the beginning of the American Revolutionary period. We did that consciously. But when I look at Brexit in the UK, when I look at the emergence of new political parties in Asia and Europe, and the magnitude of feedback and guidance that I've been often asked to provide to emerging conservative, by that I mean rule of law, limited government, low taxes, and autonomy, which is kind of, I think, one of the issues Alberta's confronting. There's a lot of connectivity, and there's been a lot written about how the Tea Party movement, beyond any question, was an inspirational force behind Brexit, which I strongly supported. In Canada, I mean, the issues are not so dissimilar from those that have emerged all over the world. These are ongoing struggles, really, and they're definitional ones because they ultimately get to the question of individual rights versus collective power, and they get to the issue of local governance versus global or national governance, and they get to the issue of representation as well, because my sense is, like the United States, Canada is just an extraordinarily large and diverse country. The issues that confront the good citizens of Alberta are entirely different than those in Toronto or Montreal or any of the Eastern power centers that are undeniably influential. And yet countries are governed, in my view, by their cities.
Yes.
But they're changed oftentimes by rural pushback. That's a story throughout the world, really, and it's been a common denominator, really, when you ponder a lot of whatever, forget the ideology. I mean, revolutions, changes of government often have come from the rural populations who have felt, a clear disengagement from their government, whether it's repression or inadequate representation or excessive taxation.
In Canada's counts, all of the above.
All of the above, fraud, corruption. Yeah, I mean, in this case, I think without, obviously it's up to Canada to do what it's going to do, and I'm respectful of Canada as a friend of the United States, an ally of the United States, and but you have a head of state in Trudeau who is very much part of a broader coalition of heads of state who have a very definitive plan for what the world, not just Canada, should look like. And this is kind of what we're going through with what we're anticipating. It's got a name, this global reset.
Yeah, the Great Reset. And Trudeau has actually come out on video. I don't think it was intentional, but he has spoken to the United Nations, quoting how the COVID-19 is their opportunity to advance their pre-pandemic plans of Agenda 2030 and the Great Reset. So, this is where I envy the U.S. a little bit, because you do have a champion through Trump for freedom, for individual rights, somebody who wants to uphold the Constitution. And here in Canada, through the Liberal Party, primarily through Trudeau, I feel that, we're pretty much halfway sold already to the United Nations. And this global agenda.
That's really problematic, and then when you ponder the fact of the priorities of these central governments and the lobbying forces and the political connections and relations, it's very easy to see in the case of Canada how these Western provinces completely get omitted and overlooked. And it's not, I think in the eyes of some, it's any degree of radical political change, like the independence of an actual province, is like conceivable or inconceivable or not realistic in their eyes. But these things have happened throughout the history. I mean, it's a common theme throughout the history of the world. And you can point very recently to these struggles for independence in just about every continent of the world. Some of them are based on the restructuring of geographic boundaries that haven't made sense. But you look at what's going on with Biafra in Nigeria. You look at the establishment of South Sudan. You look at the Eritrea's breaking off of Ethiopia. You look at what's going on within Spain and the separatist movement that exists there, Brexit, which is in a way a reestablishment of the UK's autonomy from the EU. Every European country, to my knowledge, almost has some sort of movement underway at various degrees of maturation to separate from the EU. And that's fine. I mean, like we should. Those are like real, reasonable things, and it'd be better to see those things develop in a peaceful way, as they sometimes have. Break up the Soviet Union, the Cold War, which I was heavily involved in. It wasn't a foregone conclusion, A, that it would ever end, or that B, it would end peacefully. And that proposition that I started to subscribe to in the 80s, that I felt we were moving beyond the period of containing communism, which was sort of the traditional established view of foreign policy elites that ever since the World War II, to the point of actually defeating it and liberating countries of the world, proved to be a realistic one. And it was realistic because I had been in these places and I had witnessed them. And those who were in New York and Washington and attending conferences and think tanks with other elites didn't see them. Same thing happened in the Tea Party movement. If you had been watching the world from Park Avenue or K Street in D.C., you wouldn't have seen what I saw, which was a growing recognition in the American people that they saw a country that they didn't feel they recognized any longer. And there was great fear, and fear motivates people to action. Fear and opportunity are two primary motivating forces of political instinct, and it's one of the reasons our elections, including the one we're in right now, become so contentious, because we don't have proportionate government here. Whoever ends up being sworn in on January 20 is only going to have the support of roughly half the electorate, and the other half of the electorate actually voted to go in a completely different direction. Completely different, like literally on every conceivable policy matter. And that creates, understandably, a lot of friction, a lot of tension, a lot of anger. And sometimes I wonder if there's not a better way even for us to do it here. But the case for Alberta, I think ultimately, even when I think in terms of the accomplishments during the Cold War and this breakup of communism, there's so many similarities right now. Maybe we're not, I think in China we're starting to face a global threat, and they're very much behind this global reset. They're the centerpiece of it, and they're very much the brains behind it.
Yeah, well, you mentioned a moment ago that, with the breakup of Russia, the USSR at the time, interestingly enough, I think when the threat is real and it's right in front of you, it's very visible and easy to see. I think it's a lot easier for people to rally together. Right. And what I think a lot of people didn't see, and I've spent a little bit of time in China. I was in China for 4 months back in 2004, and I came back going, my goodness, this is so capitalist. On the streets and on the ground. And, I think they've kind of communism didn't go away. I think it just got stealthier and changed its strategy and went, well, if we're not going to do a head-on military confrontation with the United States. We're going to do a stealth. We'll overtake them, but we'll do it from an economic standpoint. And, I think that's a lot harder for people to understand or to grasp because they don't see it. It's not right out in front of their faces, which here in Alberta, one of the struggles...
Well, correct that, though. It's not in the face of the elitists or the policymakers, the elected officials, but for many millions of Americans and Canadians, too, who've lost their job precisely because of this dynamic. It's very much on their mind. And I guess that's what I'm getting at, is there is this... The real disconnect in this 2020 era and going forward is that sort of divide. It's between classes of people who have not been sufficiently or well represented in this globalist structure, and the globalist structure that is very headstrong in moving in that direction. So the 16 victory of Trump, which in a lot of ways, by the way, to bring it back to the Tea Party movement, Trump spoke at Tea Party rally in 2011. That's not widely appreciated. He was impressed with the methodologies, the tactics, and the passion that was associated with the movement. I think it influenced the way he ran the 16 race. But no one, again, in 2016, who was sitting in the elite big cities of our country would have, with a straight face, have said that there was any possibility of him securing even the nomination, much less the presidency. I did endorse him on day one of his candidacy, June 16th, 2015, precisely because I saw his understanding of the impact that bad trade and bad or non-existent immigration policy, I don't want to call it bad immigration policy, it's almost thoughtless, it's just the way we go about it, we're having on the middle class of this country, and his understanding of the threat that China presented, and then his boldness, which I know, having worked in D.C., is necessary. There's not a lot of fight, really, in conservative personalities and personas. We seem to be heavy on authors and people who give lectures and a million podcasts and some TV shows. But when the rubber hits the road, which is kind of what we were going through with this 2020 election, and you say, hey, gee, was anybody responsible for making sure we didn't have a third of our electorate voting in machines that were widely known to be susceptible to cyber hacking and to vote ballot manipulation and count manipulation? I'm raising this question right now, and I'm not seeing any immediate answer. So we have $1.4 billion that went into the Republican Party, the Republican National Committee, its Senate and House equivalents. That's not even counting the Trump campaign, which raised, hundreds of millions. To my knowledge, it doesn't appear that anyone was on minding the store on this very central issue.
Well, one of the things I wrote down, and I think this is a great quote, because I think you had said one of your interviews previously, progressives worked hard to take over the country's most influential institutions while conservatives slept. It's time to stop complaining about it and get to work. And I just went, like what you had mentioned earlier, in that we do lots of complaining, we do lots of things, but when the rubber is needed to hit the road, it seems like things for conservatives to get them moving, it has to be almost catastrophic. We have to be almost to that point of zero return. And
I used to think that, but now we're at a catastrophic period where a number of us, me included, see evidence of systematic, broad electoral fraud to the point that the outcome of a U.S. presidential election has possibly been
rigged,
falsely called. Does it get any more serious than that? And I'm still not seeing the leadership out of these same individuals who fought the smallest issues over ostensibly over the importance that the Constitution held to them. So here, the centerpiece of our Constitution, that the government is accountable to the people, not the other way around, that we can remove our elected officials or re-elect them based on our perception of their performance. That's the centerpiece of everything. We have that compromised and corrupted in systematic, almost criminal conspiracy way, which is in fact what the Trump legal team has argued. This is not like Bush v. Gore in 2000. This is not a few local jurisdictions with some unclear or less than perfect voting systems. This is a vast, coordinated criminal, because it's violating the civil rights of the American people to elect their leaders, criminal conspiracy. And precisely as we are engaged right now in deciding what to do about this, which has been a centerpiece of my focus these last 5 weeks, we're seeing intrigue. I think we're learning a lot. And what we're seeing again is that the grassroots conservatives who are stepping up, a movement has already arisen on this. I expect on Saturday that we'll have over 1 million people in Washington, D.C., as it relates to pushing back on election fraud. Whatever the outcome and whoever's inaugurated on January 20, I think I've more recently concluded this issue is not going to go away because the facts haven't gone away. I mean, we're not dealing with an opposition party or an opposition ideology or a media that are acknowledging the basic facts that we know are true, that are in actual affidavits. Same stories witnessed by multiple people who, and it's deliberately complex story because it's not like the election was affected one specific way. So I could talk for hours about Dominion and Smartmatic and the problems with that. You could talk about the denial of poll watchers. By the way, in the poll watchers issue, were hundreds of thousands of ballots were illegally and almost certainly fraudulently counted in the absence of Trump and GOP poll watchers who were legally entitled, in some cases even obligated to be there, is an enormous game changer. It's also a crime, and yet we're not seeing any serious enforcement. To my knowledge, there's been no one cited or arrested over this issue. And they picked out the cities of this country where they knew they had uniform, almost totalitarian control over it. So Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Detroit, Milwaukee, Atlanta. Those are cities where you have a mayor, city council, a judicial system, a sheriff, and thus law enforcement, all politically aligned.
Mm-hmm. And so
their scenario that allowed them to do, to basically conduct this great heist of illegally of hundreds of thousands of votes.
Yeah, and I think that's where you're talking about this systemic problem. I laugh today because as a conservative, you get branded so quickly as a racist if you say something that doesn't agree with their narrative. And apparently Canada, the United States, the people who have freed slaves and have empowered all genders and all races of the world. And all of a sudden, we have a systemic racism problem. But yet I think we have a systemic, career politician problem. You look at the Nancy Pelosi's, just for example, and, Biden, 47 years. These people, this is all they know. They are so disconnected from the average, everyday working class. When I still remember watching Nancy Pelosi pull open her refrigerator drawer to, display her beautiful array of ice cream. and this is how she was going to spend her days in isolation for COVID. And I'm like, wow, this is how disconnected they are to everybody. But, coming back a little bit to Alberta and what's going on here, because a big part of the problem today is the media. And I know you had mentioned earlier, you'd done an interview with CTV, for example, here in Canada. And as a conservative, Facebook, Twitter, the censorship, the fake news, everything that's going on, how do you even get a message out today? Because most people still, in Canada in particular, rely on their media. They want to trust them, that what they're being told is indeed been fact-checked, it's accurate, and it's not biased. And I think both you and I both know that is not true. I mean, so
no, it's totally true. No, and so even in this case, which I think was on, in the days after the election, on the allegations of fraud. I mean, the position, you would think the position would be to sort of say, okay, here I am, I'm close to the legal team, I'm reading the filings, I'm aware of the legal strategy, I've read the affidavits, I've read the filings, I've read the rulings, to sort of understand it from that context. That's not the approach in that or in other outlets as well. This one was particularly bad, CTV. I mean, their position was there was zero fraud. You think about it, it's sort of interesting because I go back to August or September when it started to become apparent that the pandemic was going to hang around longer than we had hoped and that there was going to be a lot of mail-in balloting. We sort of proactively started hearing from media that mail-in balloting's got a really solid history. There's nothing really to fear. Of course, the complete opposite is true. We have a whole bipartisan commission in this country that described it as the singular most vulnerable form of voting of all options available. And we've had nothing but trouble every time it's been experimented with, including up to the primary elections. In the case of New Jersey, like literally elected officials arrested over issues, huge numbers of ballots cast by individuals who were not the recipients of them, and then just sent them in. You can't blindly mail these ballots out, even if you had impeccable voter rolls, which we have. We don't even update our voter rolls here. Democrats don't want that done for some reason. And so you have example after example where this was an issue of fraud. And as it relates to the media, that's what's different now than say 15, 20 years ago. I think ever since I've been involved, everyone's been acutely aware that there was what we call the liberal bias to the media. We would notice stories that probably were very notable that they wouldn't mention, facts that they would omit, or in the things that they did cover, you could see the ideological and partisan bias that they had. We're like 1,000 miles down the road from that now. We're literally dealing with, in the case of CTV, there was no fraud in the election, Mr. Johns. And I'm like, okay, well, you want to go state by state? We'll go through each one of these, these cases. We'll still start with Pennsylvania. That didn't happen. These are cases, and in some of these cases, we've already had judges who have affirmed that they occurred. It's literally a denial of the fact. And here's what's the most shocking to me. Not that this profession has lent itself to people of that persuasion, because I'm increasingly convinced it's not even as much ideology as it's become a cohesive influence sector where it's like joining a lobbying group. You might go in there with alternative methodologies or strategic approaches, but everyone knows what the end game is. So they don't have to sit down at a big conference board and say, okay, we got to get Trump. Everyone involved knows that's the game, and it's been the game for 4 years, to the point where we were told repeatedly by some of these networks and their anchors and their leading contributors that the President of the United States had been in collusion with one of our longest-standing traditional global rivals, enemies. An astonishing allegation to make. It would be a libelous allegation if you weren't in the public domain in the U.S. and exempted from those standards. Go through a $30 million investigation. They put 20 Hillary Clinton associated, almost all of them Clinton associated attorneys. Many of them were actually actively engaged in politically supporting her, in charge of the investigation. Go through 2 years of day-to-day repetitiously hearing that this had happened, this cloud that just hangs with the leader of the free world who's trying to get constructive things done, only to find out in that report and in other reports, including congressional ones, that no such thing happened, no such thing ever came even close to happening. And in fact, all of the crimes were in the setting up of that actual false allegation. None of those people have been held accountable. And to this day, you don't even see any sense of shame among these people who are out there saying it. These same people who scoffed when I said that, in supporting Trump, that he was an incredibly viable candidate and would be a viable nominee and could win the race.
The things I admire about Trump was one of his quotes that he said just recently, they're not coming for me. They're coming for you. And I think that's really the truth of the matter today is, these people in political power and our institutions that influence our youth in particular, because right now I do believe one of the studies in the US, 50% of all millennials believe that socialism is a great idea. And, they don't understand history. No, and this is where I come back to this quote about, while conservatives slept, because we let this happen. So instead of blaming the left for doing what the left does, we remained, apathetic on the sidelines. We didn't get involved. We didn't take a proactive approach.
This is the most important issue and so helpful to your audience that you understand this, because so you and I both have private sector experience, which, believe it or not, is not terribly common among political activists and political media. But in any private sector environment, if you were charged, as we've had billions of dollars put into these institutions that were designed to make sure that not even win these debates, just making sure that we don't completely lose the fourth estate. We don't completely lose academia to the point where you can't even, as a conservative, go out and give a speech to a conservative organization on campus without a major scene developing. Lose Hollywood, lose the entire culture. Now, apparently, even lose the integrity of our election system. And to this day, as you correctly point out, the traditional conservative response isn't, firstly, it's not sufficiently impassioned, but it is to wake up every day and point out that these facts exist. Yeah, they exist. The other side had a calculated, sophisticated, well-funded, well-led strategy to take over these institutions, and they succeeded. Those individuals on our side who were responsible for making sure that didn't happen failed. But none of those people are held accountable because we somehow are too afraid of any sort of introspective accountability along those lines.
Well, in Canada, it goes one step further because in Canada, it's government is about winning, right? It's about winning so that you hold the power. And here, unfortunately, I like
to think it's about the people.
No, it's not. I mean, even Stephen Harper did an interview with I think one of your one of the news media broadcasts in the US, and he commented, she asked him point blank, so if the Liberal Party came up with a really great idea, would you support that? And he's like, no, because it's our job to win back power. And I went, therein lies the problem, I think, politically today, is it's about power, not the people. And they think about it from themselves. So thinking about people here in the West, and I'm going to include the West because, the West is very different in ideology than the East. But it's the East that has all the seats. It's the East that has all the power. So when even you get a somewhat conservative leader, like I laugh because we say our Conservative Party of Canada is conservative. They're not conservative. They're light liberal is what they are, because their interest is not standing behind their beliefs, their principles any longer. Their interest now is to achieve power, we have to appeal to the people in the East. So Quebec and Ontario, how do we win their votes? So they don't defend their own principles and try to bring people over. They've changed to accommodate them to try to win the vote. And so I find in Canada, we're losing what it means to be conservative. It's a very popular word for politicians to throw around. But, one of the things you talked about, what does it mean to be politically conservative? It is about rule of law. It is about, fiscal responsibility. It is about family values. It is about restricted government, lower taxes, all of these things. And we're in Canada, we're not seeing that from any of our political leadership.
And even the one thing not attached to us, the safety net, is one that I think, and racial inclusiveness. Those are two areas we have a much stronger track record on than the left does. The worst countries in the world for safety nets are socialist countries. Mm-hmm. They don't have a tax base. They don't have the strong currencies, even in their fiat systems, that are able to sustain it. So, if you're falling through the cracks, this happens to a lot of people for a variety of reasons: economic transformation, job loss, health issues, drug addiction issues, all kinds of things. There is a role for government there, and the countries that do it best are those who have been more market-oriented because they have the resources on the federal and state level to be able to accommodate it. And of course, you raise this issue of allegations of racism, which is a complicated methodology, not really focused on that. It's designed to tarnish images and change the topic because there's no tolerance at all that I see in the current conservative movement for that. And I've said pointedly, in 35 years of doing this, with how many thousand closed-door meetings in the most prestigious conservative think tank in the country, and the White House and the Senate, in nonprofit areas, and the largest conservative grassroots movement in American history. I've never heard anyone even come up and suggest that. So it doesn't exist. And it does exist, obviously. I'm saying it doesn't exist within these circles that they say it exists. And I don't even know how to respond to it because it's never applicable. It's never attached to anything factually. And even in the cases where it gains a little bit of traction, you're usually having to attach a whole lot of assumptions to someone's mindset. And it's unfortunate. Trump was, I think, making some progress before the pandemic and the street riots. And these street riots were, not about much. They were about destruction. They were about taking over the daily news cycle. And their designs were uniformly destructive. There's not been one singular positive development that's come out of them. There haven't been many developments to come out of them. They took $1 billion out of the NYPD police budget. Crime rate in New York City is skyrocketing as a result. In a few other jurisdictions, the same is the case. People don't want to work in law enforcement any longer. They want to get out of it precisely at a time when we should be trying to attract not just more, but higher quality people. over $1 billion of property damage in this country. By the way, why are the sponsoring organizations like Amazon, Facebook, others who back Black Lives Matter not on the hook for the $1.34 billion in property damage that the organization they provided the resources to inflicted on us? Why after decimating the communities of this country are we now going to turn to the taxpayers of those same communities and say, okay, now you also have to pay for all of the cleanup that you also didn't cause? To me, it's we've gotten so accustomed to not standing tough and for sensible sort of adjudication of these issues. It's preposterous, and the statistics on that, which are important to recognize, because one thing we need is more statistical assessment, fact-based assessment that might point to legitimate reforms that are needed, and it might also point to false alarms.
But even speaking the truth today, you're attacked, and this is just it. And this is where I come back to the media, because the media, you would think would be the easiest to hold accountable for what they speak. And today, I find there are so many half-truths and misinformation that is being...
credibility ratings. I mean, there's no institution in the U.S. except maybe attorneys. But, for instance, I find it interesting whenever I hear media talking about Congress losing confidence. And Congress is not held in high esteem in this country, but it's about twice as more credible as mainstream media is in this country. So these institutions may not think they're doing themselves harm, but we've had an emergence of a complete new genre of conservative media in this country. No shortage of outlets, television-wise, radio-wise, online news sites. They're doing really credible jobs that, quite honestly, if the mainstream media were doing what they should have been doing all along, wouldn't even exist today. So the market share is diminishing. It's fractured. The days of 3 or 4 networks controlling all of news dissemination in the United States is over. And that's my message for Canada. Why rely on these national networks that are propagating, a certain ideology, have no tolerance for alternative views, aren't inclusive, even while they preach about the importance of inclusivity. And, I think Alberta might be a great story of the next few years if it's able to sort of establish, set aside the issue of separatism, just autonomy, if you think about Alberta, what it is about a little over 4 million people, 5 million people in Alberta, roughly.
Just over 4.
I used to always tell people, if you're looking to get politically involved, like starting on a local level is like important. You go out, you can run for school board or state representative or city council. Those 4 million people already have varying degrees of irritation with status quo. I mean, some are incredibly passionate about it because I've been aware of the separatist movement in Alberta for a couple of years at least now. Others are probably sympathetic with it, but aren't just by their nature politically involved. And then you might have some people that are neutral on it. And I doubt that you have a whole lot of really passionate, organized opponents to it. Once you start to gain momentum behind it, you're going to start to see that, Ottawa will pay more attention and they'll come out and they'll start throwing you little pieces of breadcrumbs to try to dissuade you. I think the most important strategic decision to make right now, which is one of the lessons of the Tea Party movement, I said, we're going to take our government back, right? At one point, Obama said he was willing to meet with us to talk about only the topic he wanted to talk about, of course, entitlement spending. We actually took him up on that. He never delivered. It was all political rhetoric. But for the most part, that was an uncompromising goal of mine. Is that we were not in this to score points or to feel that we could sleep better at night, that we did something. We're in it with a strategy to win. And trust me, there were plenty of internal difficulties and things to overcome, and ways that we could and still could be doing things a lot better. We don't organize well as conservatives. We don't collaborate. We work too much in isolation.
But we're individualists. So by our nature, we take the bull by the horns.
You can do a psychological profile on it, right? So, the same person who might be an incredible entrepreneur can, without any input from anyone, conceive of a business idea, launch it, monetize it, grow scale, is the same sort of person who then turns to a political issue and says, well, I'll do that. Now, as soon as you're using first-person pronouns in politics, you're going to lose. I don't care how good you are. You tell me the most successful political leaders in the history of the world, every one of them has had broad amounts of diverse, skilled people working in support of that same objective. And in fact, I would say, as much as I supported the President Trump on day one and have been out front as much as anyone in this country for him over the last 4 years, like literally as much as some people whose job in the communications functions to be doing it, the one area that he fell short on that has been an ongoing source of problem has been he has not brought in people who shared his vision. And that's true at high levels, mid levels, and low levels. So you get real famous cases like Anonymous, and sitting at the right hand of the Secretary of Homeland Security, responsible for the border wall, responsible for these immigration issues, responsible for immensely sensitive issues core to the president's mission. And this guy's going into work every day trying to undermine the president and undermine that agenda. Plenty of examples. How many books have been written? How many leaks occurred during this? I was reading a New York Times piece during the president's hospitalization, and they're literally anonymous sources criticizing the president for obtaining COVID and talking about what a political disaster it was. Anonymous sources, the president who hired you is in the hospital. It's despicable. I mean, those people should have no functional role in American government. So government has to work that way. An administration does, a congressional office does, to be effective. But so does a populist movement. And that's the biggest challenge to Alberta right now is, you can't afford to splinter. And there'll be different views on how to go about it tactically, how to go, or what the objective is, or whether it should be a complete separation or a partial separation. Trust me, if those issues haven't already emerged, and they probably have, you're going to see them emerge. Set the agenda right at the beginning. This is what we're looking to do, and go out and sell it and recruit people around that objective. The objective should probably be a complete cessation and independence. And if that's the goal, and you spell it out, you explain all the compelling reasons to do that, then you bring people in support of it. And in a province with 4 million people, your ability to organize that becomes a grassroots one. I mean, that's a mid-sized U.S. city. I mean, that's a door-to-door campaign. That's good communications and political organization will make that a very possible and probable outcome. What's the polling on that right now, by the way?
Well, I would say arguably there's probably about 25% of the population that are separatists. They would vote tomorrow probably in a referendum and say yes. But I think you could probably easily add another 25% of that go, yeah, it seems like a logical way to go. But I think when push came to shove, I think they might have second thoughts if they actually had to put a checkbox next to that alternative. And then I think there's, so many people that are just not politically involved at all or have such a distrust of.
I think there's probably a learning curve there that you see the less engaged they are in really understanding the problems, that the more opposed they likely are. So it's an educational issue. It's explaining it on it's a personal relation to, explaining on a personal level. This is how much money you're sending to this.
Alberta has sent $600 billion to Ottawa. Yeah, and people here in Alberta are afraid they wouldn't have a pension. And I'm like, that's larger than the Canada Pension Plan. Yeah. What we've already sent. And yet that's one of their biggest fears. So it is a huge education component. And I think it needs to be a little bit less, this left versus right, conservative versus liberal.
Like I said, unity, not division. I went up to New York during Occupy Wall Street, hoping that I'd be able to forge some relationship just on some banking themes, and broke down because it's a movement of insanity and anarchy, not of any cohesive strategy, but it would have been an incredible accomplishment. My view tactically is if you can agree with someone on 1% things, you work on those 1%. This idea that we can't, as long as you can constrain it to that 1%, you're not doing any damage. You're only advancing this cause. And I don't think this is a conservative or a liberal issue. In fact, restoring greater levels of autonomy to the province allows more direct democracy and more control over whatever direction you ultimately want to take, which may evolve. What it is today might not be what it is 20 years from now. But the idea of expecting that to be dictated from a central government, it's a much more difficult undertaking. It's not impossible, but it's the easier way to go about it is that way.
Well, if Trudeau has his way, that's exactly how it will happen. We will all be, subject to the Great Reset and whatever globalist leaders say. And Bill Gates will be tracking our every move through, forced vaccines and and it's so funny because people think that all of this is conspiracy. And yet, even our prime minister, who's now come out and publicly stated it and has been caught on video, it's been, Tucker Carlson aired it on Fox News, and still people don't want to see it. They refuse to believe it somewhat. And yet there's other people who feel that things are so far gone, they're losing hope. So, to me, I find people need a little courage right now. To stand up and feel empowered that this is still their government. And that's where, the National Tea Party, you guys accomplished that. So how do we go about that here in Alberta to rally people, to give them some hope, some encouragement, courage to say, let's get out. We can make a difference. We can make the change.
I think the incremental victories are also important. And if I thought enough about the Alberta Independence Initiative, I'd probably find some. But one of the immediate challenges is you look at it, you're not independent. So you're going from, this status quo to, this outcome that's so far down the road that probably has several different incremental steps. But, to be able to start to show the momentum and the progress, both in the debate, in the shifting mindsets, maybe even in symbolic victories. I think in terms of symbolism as well, of emphasizing Alberta and ways that you can do that. That's really where I think that all heads. I have to think every one of those, and I know Alberta's the one that's most out front, but I think every one of those Western provinces is probably confronting very similar issues, right?
Mm-hmm. And so with you guys, though, you're in a day of sense.
Think in global coalitions, too. Even though we're not globalists, all these separatist movements that are seeking greater autonomy around the world, have a lot of commonality, both in why they want what they want, the abuses they've sustained because they haven't had it, and the institutional resistance that they're confronting as they try to set about obtaining it. And that sort of forum, which I would be interested in helping you with if you do move forward with it. But Catalonia and Spain, and they're going through the same process. We want to do this. The people generally want to do it. The people who aren't for it just don't understand the case for it yet. What do we do? And getting some institutions on board, and is useful. And if the media in Alberta are not supportive, you got to get engaged in that or create your own outlets. There's a lot of components to it. And I'll bet you there's among those 4 million plus citizens of Alberta, I'll bet there's probably hundreds of thousands of really compelling individual stories where you individualize the story of the impact that this has had on them in 100 different ways. Because every policy guideline that's constraining, holding you back, moving in directions you don't want to move, is dictated by a paradigm that you're resisting.
Absolutely. And so, what was probably the number one biggest obstacle or challenge that you guys encountered, and how did you resolve that?
Well, there were external challenges and internal ones. Externally, literally, no one wanted to move in the direction we wanted to move, even though a lot said they did. We were faced with the two-faced nature of American politics. So the RNC, for instance, would say the Republican, National Committee would publicly be supportive because they were too afraid not to be. And then simultaneously, in actions, they would be completely contradictory to the rhetoric. Obviously, some of the efforts to disparage the movement didn't help with these broad allegations that are so damning. But they were so, when you ponder thousands upon thousands upon thousands of events and no barrier to entry, right? We don't have time, effort, even no ability to sit there and screen somebody's, the idea that we had zero violence, okay, in 11 years and ongoing. And this movement, broadly praised by media, has contributed to over a dozen deaths and the billion-plus property damage itself is incredible and a tribute to the members of the Tea Party movement. Our messaging was largely responsible and consistent, which is incredible given a movement of 40 million people. And then internally, the issue was the one I mentioned, of bringing people together, meaning when push comes to shove and we both want to go do the same thing, are you going to go do it on your own and let me to do it myself, or are you and I going to do it together and have it be twice as effective? So I ran even Tea Party outreach on some campaigns. I would go into some cities that would have 4 different Tea Party organizations because they had disagreed over a candidate or an issue. And as soon as they had the first disagreement, they would just split. When they should be putting much more focus on resolving those issues, and if they can't resolve them, tolerating them. So as opposed to 4 groups with 100 members, there should be 1 group with 400 members. And we dilute the effectiveness of our political messaging and our unity when we do that. And there's nothing, if you are facing a biased media, there's nothing that they love to see more than divisiveness and splitting it up. And I face that in my support for Trump. I mean, if I wanted to critique this president at any moment in the slightest of ways, I could have had a op-ed in the New York Times tomorrow, or in the Sunday New York Times, and it would be a huge, global national news story. That's what they want to see, and that's what can't be delivered. And that means not just an effort of cohesiveness, but also understanding among people that are involved how important this really is, and how divisiveness, even if it's been seemingly benign, dilutes the ultimate goal.
Yeah, it's keep coming back to why are we all doing this? What's the bigger objective? And you bring up a really good point when you talk about how it needs to be we, because that's one of the things that I think Trump definitely, even when he speaks, on national TV, he says I,
Right.
and that's one of the things that, like it or not, Biden, when he spoke, he looked at the people, right? He made it feel like he was talking to them, for them, on behalf of them, and I think realistically, if we're gonna,
it was probably one of the more incoherent presidential. It probably was the single most incoherent political campaign in American history. And nor was there much of it, which was perplexing to us. But if there was a plan B that we're now seeing, that makes a little more sense now than it did then, right?
Absolutely. Just hide him in the basement. We'll deal with it all afterwards. But so it's this matter of inclusiveness, because here in Alberta, you hear it all the time. You can't split the vote. You can't split the vote. You can't split the vote. But that's with the big parties. And this is how they tend to fearmonger, even in amongst we can't even have a truly conservative party that represents the people. And one of the things that I loved about the Tea Party is that you guys are not government, but the amazing amount. But you are. But it's the
government. I mean, Mark Meadows, Mike Pompeo.
I understand that, but it's the influence you had on government in the beginning that really got you to where you are. And it because everybody seems to think, well, you have to form government right away and you have to do this. But I find personally that sometimes a really good, even if it's small, strong opposition or strong inside of, but it takes courage again, right? And
these are largely these elected officials are, I'm immensely stereotyping because there's a lot of exceptions to this, but they're predominantly very shallow and selfish and self-absorbed people. And while they may try to not depict themselves that way, if you promise them any considerable electoral threat to their political career, you're going to find they're going to quickly you're going to get a response. I mean, they're either going to go one of two ways. They're either going to be immensely accommodating, or they're going to declare war. And I don't like to declare wars that I can't win, or threaten wars even that aren't winnable. But as you build momentum, you should be able to do what I did many times without naming names. I mean, I told elected officials, some of whom are now not there because of these conversations, that we expected A, B, and C votes on these issues, and their outright support on them. Many of them didn't deliver on that. We delivered, and I delivered on promises to primary them. And there's some icons in this country, in the Republican establishment who thought they were going to be there forever, who are now gone. Mm-hmm. And that threat wouldn't have meant much if it couldn't be backed up. So the key is to build the force that allows you to meet with elected leaders and say, this is what we want done. And by the way, all of this sounds profoundly aggressive, but that is what a democratic political system is. That's what the left does all the time, routinely. All of these ideas that have emerged that seem so immensely controversial and not typical within, say, how corporations are focusing and structuring, or institutions are, or how all of athletics has been taken over by all this. Trust me, there was no one in the NFL office focused on these issues until Kaepernick and then others followed, and then built support, and then went in. And ultimately, as recently as right before this season, you look at the NFL commissioner reading the position of the NFL that was written by these activist players. I suppose that's a sign. I don't know whether it's a sign. I guess it's a sign of some degree of leadership weakness. I think we're in an era, I think we've been living in a life without a lot of leadership. And when it comes along, as it did in the Tea Party movement, as it did in Trump's candidacy, people are gravitating to it because that's really ultimately what they want. They think they know what's right. They want to be validated in that. And that's one of the real benefits of political organization. It's the psychology behind people who become politically involved. They do want these changes that they are representing with. They're committed to them. But I think there's a social, sort of socio-psychological benefit that comes from it as well. They want to know that they're not alone in seeing things this way. So, when you articulate to them that, you're not alone in this view of independence, and not only that, but, here's 10 more reasons for it that you might not have even thought about, it's reassuring to them. They feel more assimilated into the process. So no one wants to feel alone in these issues. It's hard enough even when you're not.
Well, that's how the left has won, is by isolating everybody, dividing everybody, and then this group, feels like they're against this group, and it is that feeling of alone, because there is no greater fear. This is why COVID has been so hard. When we're social animals, right? We're social beings. We want the company of other people. We want to know that, there is some herd comfort, right, in numbers. But if you had to give, 3 pieces of advice, things that, should be done, could be done, right now, noting that where Alberta is at, what would that be?
Number one is I would make sure this is organizationally structured, meaning that there's a singular place to go to be informed, to learn about, and to be updated on the status of this movement. Number 2, I would think big in terms of objectives. That's easier than thinking small. Meaning, don't say, hey, we're going to explore the possibility of maybe seeing if 30 years from now we could be independent. That's not leadership, and it's not going to inspire anyone. We will be independent, okay? Matter of fact, okay? So, but we would like you involved in that process. It's not even if you're involved, we can do it. We are going to be, but we want you involved, is the way it needs to be communicated. And then make sure that the individuals, I guess this 3 is, make sure to individualize the communication of this. They're going to have their responses. All of these issues have, there's compelling arguments in both cases. I mean, it's not, like we just sort of ended up in this situation. They just happen to have been a little more assertive, organized, and persistent on them. But make sure that the issues of what we call it the forgotten man and woman during the 2016 Trump campaign, the forgotten man and woman of Alberta, has been neglected by this government in Ottawa. And what can be done to highlight his or her story, bring a human face to the story. Don't make it a wonkish policy debate that people tune out. That one man or woman story probably represents many thousands others who can put themselves right in their shoes. Once you communicate it in those terms, people who aren't prone to be involved in efforts of this magnitude or political endeavors generally will find themselves inspired to become involved.
Fantastic. And we're running out of time here, but before we go, I've got one question. This is a big question. Is it Donald Trump president for 2021?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I will tell you that the thing we've accomplished is that we are uncovering facts in a very diligent, aggressive way that day by day you're starting to see a broader recognition of the magnitude of this. We've already seen a lot of this original censorship that existed. It's become so indefensible, because we're now, we're talking about affidavits, we're talking about cases. This election was organized in a criminal way to alter the vote. I don't think they anticipated Trump doing as well as he did, and I think what happened is, like any criminal who is about to get caught or doesn't have the plan completely thought through, they got a little sloppy. So the evidence is all out there, and the constitutional options are out there. And it's not just these courts. There's way too much focus. We could lose all these court cases and still have the constitutional remedy of state governments and the state houses and Senate, being able to designate delegates. I would wish we never ended up in this situation. I'm not proud of it. I'm going to fight through it. I'm one of the leaders in this fight. And I will say this, it's not for me an act of symbolism or an act of partisanship or blind loyalty, because these things really did happen. And I don't believe I've ever before in my life contested or said that a candidate whom I've supported and I've been involved for over 30 years, 40 years almost, I've ever alleged that a candidate had been cheated. But Donald Trump was cheated. There are vast numbers of those in Biden's camp that don't belong there. And we have, I think, a very emerging movement in this country that's designed to ensure that representative democracy is preserved and not corrupted.
I think that's the key there. It's that if you don't have the confidence in your electoral system, then we're no better than a Venezuela or any country that, has a dictator that they can just fudge whatever.
Narrative, though. I mean, this is an example of the narrative. So that the position of the media is we're eroding that confidence in pointing out this fraud. We're responding to the fraud. The people who eroded the confidence were the people who perpetuated the criminal act of the fraud.
But we're living in an upside-down world where the victim is actually the criminal and the criminal is the victim. And this is how the media...
We need to put that out there. Sometimes we just talk through it and accept this upended world that's presented to us, but that's not the way it is. I've spent my life defending this system in this country and around the world, and be the last thing I did. And I'd be the first person to say if I didn't believe that there were legitimate, legitimate legal issues here as it relates to criminal voter fraud, I would be the first one to be saying, concede this election, we'll get them next time, stay active in public life, wish Biden well, and let's move on. I'm not saying that because that is not at all reflective of the facts that I'm confronting. Every day I'm confronting facts that point more and more, and this is true of anyone looking at it, point more and more to an extraordinary amount of coordinated voter fraud in the 2020 election.
No, they're afraid of him. So thank you so much for taking the time, and I do hope.
I wish you very I wish you a lot of success in your undertaking, and to all Albertans. And I hope that I can be helpful as you move along in this very daring undertaking. It's an incredibly important one, and everyone, you deserve praise for launching it.
Well, I have you on video having said that you're willing to help. So
yeah. So I'm not going to be ambassador to Canada. Well, maybe I will. Forgive me on that. This is just informational counsel.
Well, fantastic, Michael. Thank you so much for taking the time. And I do hope that maybe we can follow up here in the new year and talk a little bit more about the election and the outcome.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to it. And a pleasure speaking with you.
Fantastic. Have a great day.
You too. Bye.
So everyone, if you like this video, if you enjoyed the meeting, please hit the subscribe button. Please make sure that you hit the like and the little notification so that you get future videos. Again, thank you to Michael Johns. He has been extremely difficult to get in touch with because he has been extremely, extremely busy as it relates to what's been going on in the United States in the election. And we really did want to talk today a little bit about Alberta separation and greater autonomy and what that means, and the steps forward in progressing some of the ideals and what's important to Albertans. So again, if you enjoyed this, make sure you hit subscribe, like, and the little bell. Thank you for watching.